So I want to remind us first off that this is according to Ernest Holmes, you are an eternal being, now on the pathway of endless unfoldment, never less, but always more yourself. So our ground of being is that we are eternal beings. We are divine people, humans having divine beings having a human experience. And so as you stand up here, as I stand up here, I don't know what's going to happen next. I prepared, but that doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. I am vulnerable, and I want to see all of you, the love that you are. It's better this way. And I want you to see me as a divine being doing the best you can. Because vulnerability is a state of being. We are all vulnerable. It's not like you have a choice. There's uncertainty, we need to be courageous, and we need to take risks. So being vulnerable is a fact of life, and it's not just for us. And Reverend Julia, the last 2 Sundays, has set some groundwork for us with the vulnerability, with knowing that we are vulnerable. And this is just so perfect that we would have vulnerability as the theme for this month, considering how many layers of vulnerability we're experiencing. I don't know about all of you, but when I got up in the morning several times this last winter, I felt really vulnerable because we had like 5 feet of snow. And some of you had less, but some of you also lost your electricity. And when we lost our electricity, there went the water. Except that we had a generator until the generator died. So it brought vulnerability to me at a deeper level this last winter. I don't know if any of you experienced it. I'm seeing some heads going like this. Yes. Because, that's a fact of life. And Madalyn said this: when we were children, we used to think that when we grow up, we would no longer be vulnerable. But to grow up is to accept vulnerability. To be alive is to be vulnerable. It's not like you get to vote. You do not get to vote. You are vulnerable. You are vulnerable on an emotional level, on a physical level, on a social level. And all of those things bring strength, and they vary. It's a variance. So sometimes you'll feel vulnerable, and other times you won't. But you are actually vulnerable the whole time. Are you deluded or not? So when you come into this world as a little baby, an infant, you are vulnerable. Love, care, you are dependent on others for everything. And it does kind of go up from there. Because then when you're 2, you can talk about it and say stuff. But it goes up and down like this. So you're fragile, needing care. And then when we're adults, I'm speaking for myself, I had this feeling that I was pretty invincible. I had control over things. I knew what to do. I had a handle on it. I was cocky. Was I deluded? Absolutely. I did not realize. But I was opening to life, opening to love and connections, and that's vulnerability. Have you ever had to ask somebody out? Hello? That's vulnerable. Have you ever told someone you love them? Be the first one to say it. That's vulnerable. And then now, as I'm growing older, I'm complaining about the increase in maintenance for my body. That's vulnerability. That's like, Madalyn, no, it's probably not a good idea to jump up on that ladder. And you need to hold on. There's all these different things that it's like, oh, things have changed, things have shifted. And you're vulnerable in a different way, or at least you understand now that you're vulnerable in that new way. It's like, oh, I was always vulnerable. That's just the way it is. It's whether I'm sharing it and going for it or not. So how vulnerable do you want to be? How much do you want to live? How much love do you want in your life? How do you want to show up? How do you want to be seen? This last week has been like a journey because I was like, my brain, whenever I do a talk, the week before, Gary has to live through this because I'm like, all these little things are going in my head. It's like, da, 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 da. And it's a little crazy making. But one of the things that came to me as I woke up yesterday morning was, who do I really admire who has been vulnerable on a scale that I can't even imagine? And Oprah Winfrey came to my mind. She came from poverty in Mississippi. She lived with her grandmother, her mother, her father. She was all over the place. She came from what I would, in my life, would be nothing. And she was so vulnerable and shared so much of herself, her truth, who she really is. She went all out to share the love, the light. And she is beloved by so many people. She has taught so many lessons to so many people because she lived out her vulnerability. She accepted it. She didn't hide it. She was transparent. This is real. This is authentic. This is me. This is me. And I love me or don't love me. But this is me. So, thank you, Julia. So it's the risk is amazing, and not taking the risk is even more scary because then you don't live your life. Grabbing on to it, your leading edge. What is there for you? So this morning I woke up with this realization that a lot of you obviously lived through this too. Back in 2000 or so, Gary and I decided to move up here to Nevada City, Grass Valley, so we did. And then my mother went into hospice, and I went down to Thousand Oaks, and I would spend 2 weeks there, come home for the weekend, and go back and forth, back and forth. So that was huge for me. My mother raised me. I love her dearly still. And then September 2001, the World Trade Centers and more. It wasn't just the World Trade Center. So the invulnerability that we may have felt as the United States was swept away. It was gone. The vulnerability that came up for all of us. I can still feel it when I was watching the television with my mother, who was horrified, who said, "Let me out of this world. I don't want to be here anymore." And then she did die. And she wanted to go at that point. She was done. She had had cancer. And so then I felt really vulnerable because at some level I felt like I was an orphan. It was a huge shift. So I was supported with love by my husband, thank God, and my sister and the rest of my family. And we were all incredibly vulnerable. But life goes on. Because risking not loving is not worth it. Everything you love, you will lose. And you love it anyway. So then, after my mom passed, Gary and I decided to keep on living. And one of the things that was important is that we had come to the Sierra Center for positive living back then in Seaman's Lodge. Some of you go back that far, some of you don't. So we started coming to the center that long ago. And life goes on. So we were out to lunch, and I was standing in the lobby of this restaurant, and somebody picked my pocket out of my purse. And they got various other things that I don't remember, but they got my passport, my identity, because we were getting ready to go on a trip to the British Virgin Islands. So they took my passport, and I was devastated because I was already so vulnerable, and then that was just one more thing. But everything worked out okay, and we did get in the car, which is another really vulnerable thing we do all the time, getting in a car. We drove to the airport, and we got on an airplane, which is another vulnerable thing that a lot of you guys do. And we flew to the British Virgin Islands, and they did let me in. I don't know, there was some paperwork. That was in the old days, where you had paperwork, and there was actually rules that you could probably massage. And that's not true anymore, because we clamped down, because now we're more vulnerable. So anyway, so here we're in British Virgin Islands. So what Gary and I do is we're renting a sailboat, and we're going bareboat sailing. That means it's just the two of us on a 40-foot sailboat. We actually knew what we were doing back then. But we're still vulnerable because you're sitting in a bunch of water on a boat, and stuff happens to boats. Anyway, so just to wrap this up a little bit, then what we did next is we decided to go scuba diving. Well, that's no risk to scuba dive. That's not risky. No, it's like no big deal. We did actually know how to do it. So another boat came to get us and took us to a dive spot. So this was like the best dive in my whole life, because we dove on the wreck of the Rhone. We dove on a shipwreck. So all through this whole story, it's like vulnerable, vulnerable, vulnerable. It's like, but we reached out to grab life. Yeah. We reached out to grab life, to really, truly live. And we all do this on our own levels. Every time you love a beloved pet, since we have a beloved pet here today, you're taking a risk, you're being vulnerable. I've had beloved animals pass away. Talk about being vulnerable. But I wouldn't give up the years of love for those few months of despair or grief, because it's healing grief, it's deep grief, it's loving grief. And the same thing's having friends and having a community like this one. Having people that you've known forever, it seems like. And being in community in this level, or like a circle, a book circle, a soul collage circle, or whatever it is. But you've got love, you've got belonging, and you've got joy that comes forth because you do these things, because you allow yourself to be vulnerable. So I'd like you to take a minute and think about a time, when in your past when you were vulnerable and you knew it, and that the love, and it could be recent, it could be a long time ago, but what is one of your vulnerability stories? I'm going to give you a minute to think about it while I get something to blow my nose with. We all have these stories, these sacred experiences that are possible because we're vulnerable. And things are changing so fast. We didn't used to be vulnerable on the internet. Now you have to watch out for scams. Or, this is worse. They come along and do an update to one of your programs. And they update stuff and they move stuff around, and then I don't know where it is. I get really vulnerable, upset about that. Really? Yeah. It's like, what? They're moving. It's like, well, now I don't know how to do something. It's like I knew how to do it yesterday, but they updated. Yeah, bad words. And then climate change. It's not just us that's vulnerable. It's all the plants, the animals, the planet. So when we're deluded, we don't think there's a problem. And I don't want to be a downer, but I want to be real. Those of you who've looked at vulnerability at all have run across this woman named Brené Brown. I recommend there's on Netflix, there's a program for an hour and a half, I think it's the Call to Courage, where she's given a talk. She's also got TED Talks out there on vulnerability. But she has this one quote: "We cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known. And when we honor the spiritual connection that grows from that offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection." That's what we're here for. We're here for that. And I feel vulnerable because I can't see the clock because that light blind. Okay. It's funny. It's little things, little vulnerabilities, little remembrances. And now the other thing and she goes into all sorts of stuff, which I recommend you go to Netflix if you have it and see it. But she talks about trust. Does trust come first or does vulnerability come first? I would say that they're interwoven and that you're careful where you're vulnerable. You build that trust, that respect, that confidence that you're enveloped in love. That's why sometimes small groups are really cool. And that's why this center does small groups as well as the large gatherings. Because it's very important. You cannot do life alone and do it really well. You need to be vulnerable. You need to be connected with other people. From my point of view. So I'm busy telling you what I believe. And you get to vote, you get to choose. You get to choose. So one of the things that I feel is going on right now is this center is in a vulnerable spot. We are in a fragile spot as a community because there's been big changes. Now, have we been through this before? Absolutely yes. And we've come forward with genuine caring and sharing our treasures, our talents, our time, and that's what it takes to build community. So we're in this big transition right now, and that's why the community meeting after this service is important, because it's a change, it's an evolution, it's a recreation, it's a rebirth. And I went back to when I was an infant. I didn't realize this at the time, but I was very, very vulnerable. And so right now we're being infants again. We're getting to be reborn, rebirthed, redone. And the first thing that happens with that, some of you may be familiar with Bill Bridges' work. The first thing that happens in that kind of a transition is endings. So that there are things that have been lost, things that have left our lives. Reverend Rafe and Deborah are gone, and some of the other stuff, some of the other people that were connected to them chose not to come back. Normal, totally normal. And people that haven't been around have come back. Totally normal. And we get to co-create what's next. Because we're in that nebulous, we're in that cocoon right now. We don't know what's going to be next. We don't know whose energy and whose love and whose light is showing up. And we don't know. We just don't know. We're in that in-between time, that unknown. And sometimes we go backwards. Sometimes we'll go back to the grief of change or something else. That, it's like, it could be all sorts of things. Jeff Wright and his band left. People grieve to that. There's change constantly happening. It's just how aware are we of it. And then there's the new beginning. Because there's always, hello, hey, wait a second, things are different around here. I really like it. I can count on things. I know this isn't going to change right away. It'll change, but not necessarily right away. So all that's happening. So we don't know right now what this community is going to look like, what it means, what it could mean to you in the future. We get to co-create it. So take a second here. I'll give you a minute or so. And think about this question. What are your dreams or aspirations for being in sacred community? What are your dreams or aspirations for being in sacred community? Because no matter what, you will be giving and you will be receiving. And you will be vulnerable and you will be loved. Whew. So I'd encourage everyone to stay after for the visioning and the meeting. And one other thing that I want for myself and all of you is to have no regrets at the end of your life. To have been vulnerable, been full out there, be seen, so that you can feel that you've fully lived, been fully seen. And you can't do that all by yourself at home. Oh, unless you're on Zoom, maybe. See, nowadays, it's more possible. We used to do these talks, and nobody would ever see them again. And now, oh God, they're on Zoom, or they're on YouTube or whatever. It's like, what? So I try not to screw up, because I feel more vulnerable, because it has a life after this moment. It's constant changing. That technology stuff is rough. It's hard. Yeah. And I live with someone who's a genius with it. And you're not going anywhere, are you, Gary? But yes, one day, Yes, one day he will, or I will. And I have that vulnerability, and I love him full out. Because it's totally worth it. And so will grief be. So will grief be. So, here's a question again. What experience that calls for vulnerability and entails risk would you regret at the end of your life if you didn't go for it? Where do you long to be seen? What experience that calls for vulnerability and entails some risk would you regret at the end of your life if you didn't go for it? Where do you long to be seen? And the answer is for you. So one last thing that came to me this morning. And I came up with the quote, but I couldn't come up with who said it. And then I was delighted when I found out who said it. Honesty and transparency make you vulnerable. Be honest and transparent anyway. People are unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Love them anyway. Mother Teresa. So love yourself enough to be vulnerable. Thank you for listening.